Hello and welcome to the fourth week of the Tolkien and the Gospel Summer Growth Series hosted by Church of the Redeemer in Greensboro, North Carolina. This video is a part of a series of lectures and discussions about just a few of the ways that Tolkien's fantasy works can inform and shape our moral imagination as Christians. I'm Hunter Van Wagenen, and as you can see, I am not in my normal place. I am visiting my in-laws for the 4th of July. But here we are, and we're still going to have our discussion on Wednesday. This week we're going to talk about the topic of history and providence. Is fate a fixed thing, or is it possible for us to have a hand in shaping our own destiny? Is all of history just a series of random events without any guiding principle or order? Or is there something or someone determining what happens? These are the questions that philosophers have asked for or sought to answer about history since human beings found out there was such a thing. And our answers to such questions have far-reaching impact on how we live our lives, how we interact with our fellow human beings, and how we understand the human self and its place in our world. Now, most people I know seem to keep their opinions about free will in their subconscious, because regardless of one's faith, it's hard to ignore evidence of both free will and some kind of purpose impacting human history. In fact, it seems that human beings are designed to both seek meaning out of history and be agents within history. Even from people who would deny belief in fate or divine predestination, it's quite common to hear reference to the right side or the wrong side of history. That seems to presume that history is going in a morally prescribed direction. And I doubt that the body of someone who believes everything is predetermined would fail to react if they noticed a 20-ton bus barreling toward them. Making the choice to jump out of the way, a perfectly logical reaction, by the way, would seem to point to a certain amount of agency on the part of the human person. Now, of course, there are nuances to this discussion, and that's why we've had this debate for every generation. But the fact is that in every time and place and generation, we cannot escape these two dueling ideas that we are both products of forces outside our control, and we have the responsibility of choice in the times and the places in which we find ourselves. Now, Scripture doesn't alleviate the tension between these two ideas, but it does give us some categories and helpful narrative examples of how God and His people work within history. More importantly, though, it gives us the assurance that the guiding principle of history in our universe is the loving hand of God that we call providence, and that the end of history is a good ending. One prime example of God's goodness winning out in the Old Testament is the story of Joseph, which is at the end of the book of Genesis. Joseph is favored by his father Jacob, both because of his wisdom and his faithfulness, and because he's the natural son of Jacob's favored wife, Rachel. When Joseph's jealous older brothers conspire to get rid of him and sell him to slavers, Joseph ends up in Egypt and eventually gains a place in Pharaoh's court that enables him to preserve many lives through a great famine. Throughout Joseph's story, we see that he meets extremely difficult situations with virtue. Even though he is enslaved, he serves his master faithfully. Though he is imprisoned on false charges from his master's wife, he embraces wisdom and he seeks God even in prison. So when his brothers eventually join him in Egypt, because that's where the food is, they begin to fear some retribution for their past sins against their brother. Joseph's response might be one of the best summaries of God's providence in Scripture. This is Genesis 50, starting at verse 19. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Now, there are many more examples from the Old Testament where we see people making free choices either for good or for evil, and where we see God acting within history to turn even evil actions into good outcomes. In the last video, I talked about God choosing, setting apart, or we might say ordaining, a specific person like he does with Abraham or David, or a tribe or a nation like he does with Israel. But each of those individuals, each of those tribes and nations retain a free will to act according to their calling. In fact, much of the Old Testament is either a narrative of the chosen people living up to or failing to live up to their calling, or it's a prophetic reflection on Israel's failure and God's steadfast goodness and loving covenant love. In fact, the non-narrative portions of the Old Testament, the Psalms in particular, provide us with a helpful model of finding and maintaining hope in God's goodness and covenant love, even when circumstances seem dire. Hebrew spirituality was grounded in history, so in looking for evidence to hope, the writers of the Psalms looked back on God's acts in history. They looked back at events like the Exodus out of Egypt, the taking of the Promised Land, and God's deliverance from oppressors as cause for hope that God would continue to act graciously with his people and would deliver them from current trials. God's faithful action and intervention inform his people's hope for the present. Now, when we look at the New Testament, we again see a number of unlikely people chosen or ordained for a great task. Mary is chosen despite her insignificance in the eyes of the Roman world, and her answer, "Let it be so," her choice, is the beginning of God's final defeat of sin, death, and the devil. Many of the disciples are chosen despite their lack of power, wealth, education, influence. Paul is chosen in spite of his virulent persecution of Christians. And each of them, with the exception of Judas, live up to their callings with various bumps or failures along the way. Jesus uses the parable of the talents to help explain the interaction between providence and free will. Some are given much, others little, but responsibility and choice is given to all of us to do God's will with what we've been given. We get no indication that the servant who receives 10 talents has any particular merit or power that sets him apart from the servant who receives 1. But each servant shows his virtue or lack thereof in how he uses the talents given to him. So we might apply this to our New Testament examples and say that many of them had only 1 talent, but their faithfulness to God's calling led to the founding of the church and the spread of God's kingdom that we see all over the world today. Now, as for our hope for a good ending, the singular event and ground for our hope as Christians is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Whether we are taking the short view and looking at our own current circumstances, or whether we are taking the long view and wondering where history is taking us as a human race, Jesus' resurrection is our firm and final assurance that the outcome will be good. No matter the evidence to the contrary in the news or in our own personal lives, Jesus' resurrection from the dead is God's proof and promise to us that he will bring history to a good and joyful end. If death, which is the worst possible thing that we can imagine as living creatures, can be defeated and undone, what victory might God win over our other trials and tribulations? Now, you've heard me say it 3 times already, but here it is again. Fairy tales are uniquely suited to form our imaginations to better accept this truth. Good fantasy, with its clear delineation between good and evil, right and wrong, virtue and wickedness, is marked by the trait that good, right, and virtue always win. Now, this is sometimes criticized by us cynical modern people as boring or simplistic, but remember what the purpose of a fairy tale is. The metaphors and symbols contained in them are meant to convey spiritual and invisible truths, not only an interesting story. In fact, I'd argue that if you or your child begins to pick apart your good fairy tales because they're too predictable, that's actually a sign that you're beginning to really understand the truth underlying them. The truth is, just as the world of fantasy sees good winning over evil every time, regardless of the obstacle, our world is no different. Like I said, if God could destroy sin, death, and the devil in the resurrection of Jesus, we can rest assured that the ending of our world story, that the ending of our personal stories, is just as happy as the simplest fairy tale. So how does The Lord of the Rings specifically help form our imaginations to accept the truths of free will, providence, and all things ending well? Not surprisingly for a language expert who invented over 20 different languages, Tolkien affirms these truths by employing a word he coined himself, the eucatastrophe. So what does this invented word mean? Well, let's break it down. Most of you are probably familiar with the negative use of the word catastrophe. It's usually used as a synonym of the word disaster. We might refer to Chernobyl as a catastrophe. But it also has a literary meaning. If you break the word down into its Greek prefix and verb, it means kata, against, and strophe, turn. So altogether you get turn against. In Greek dramas, you often had a point in the story, usually the climax, where everything turned against the main character. Think of poor Oedipus, who realizes at the end of his story that he's killed his father and he's married his mother despite all of his attempts to thwart fate, a prophecy that was made at the beginning of the story. And a lot of Greek drama employed the catastrophe, and it was usually for a tragic ending, like Oedipus. Tolkien adds the Greek prefix eu, spelled EU, which means good. So altogether, eucatastrophe would mean something like a climactic good turn of events. It's interesting to note that Tolkien referred to Jesus' incarnation as the eucatastrophe of history. And he also referred to Jesus' resurrection as the eucatastrophe of the incarnation. So how do we see this principle at work in Tolkien's books? I'm going to read a couple of passages that I think especially highlight his treatment of free will and providence, and then we're going to talk about some more examples. First, I'm going to read a passage from the beginning of the Silmarillion, and this is probably going to be the only passage I read from outside The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings in this video series. This passage comes from the first section, which is titled the Ainulindale, which serves as a kind of creation myth for the world of Middle-earth. In it we see angelic beings making music as they've been taught by the god Ilúvatar, and as they sing they see that their music takes shape in a created world. It's a beautiful scene, and I'd encourage you to read it all sometime. But one of these angelic beings begins to seek his own glory and power rather than the harmony with the other's music, and that's where we'll pick up. But being alone, Melkor had begun to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike those of his brethren. Some of these thoughts he now wove into his music, and straightway discord arose about him, and many that sang nigh him grew despondent, and their thought was disturbed, and their music faltered. But some began to attune their music to his rather than to the thought which they had at first. Then the discord of Melkor spread ever wider, and the melodies which had been heard before foundered in a sea of turbulent sound. But Ilúvatar sat and hearkened until it seemed that about his throne there was a raging storm, as of dark waters that made war upon one another in an endless wrath that would not be assuaged. Then Ilúvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that he smiled, and he lifted up his left hand, and a new theme began amid the storm, like and yet unlike to the former theme. And it gathered power and had new beauty. But the discord of Melkor rose in uproar and contended with it, and again there was a war of sound more violent than before, until many of the Ainur were dismayed and sang no longer, and Melkor had the mastery. Then again Ilúvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that his countenance was stern, and he lifted up his right hand, and behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion, and it was unlike the others. For it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds and delicate melodies. But it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity. And it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Ilúvatar, and they were utterly at variance. The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. The other had now achieved a unity of its own, but it was loud and vain and endlessly repeated, and it had little harmony, but rather a clamorous unison as of many trumpets braying upon a few notes. In an essay to drown the other music by the violence of its voice, but it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own solemn pattern. In the midst of this strife, whereat the halls of Iluvatar shook and a tremor rang out into the silences yet unmoved, Iluvatar arose a third time, and his face was terrible to behold. Then he raised up both hands, and in one chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Iluvatar, the music ceased. Then Iluvatar spoke, and he said, "Mighty are the Ainur, the mightiest among them is Melkor. But that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Iluvatar, those things that ye have sung, I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument, in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." Okay, long passage, I know, but isn't it some of the most beautiful prose you've ever heard? Now, obviously there's a lot going on here, but the main parts we're focusing on are the music and Iluvatar's final word. We see that Melkor, who's later known in the story as Morgoth, introduces strife that rises to a clamorous unison as of many trumpets. It makes me think of that World Cup where most of the crowd had those plastic vuvuzela trumpet things. But Iluvatar's music cannot be thwarted, and with a final chord he ends the music. Then he tells Melkor, in essence, that God's will be done. Any attempts to alter it will lead to wonderful things the meddler could never have imagined. So that's sort of a bird's eye view of Providence. Let's now look at the more familiar characters that we know and love. There are many lines and passages that speak of fate, chance, luck, calling. Elrond, for instance, begins his council in the Fellowship of the Ring by acknowledging that most of the people present were not summoned by him, but rather have been brought there, he says in so many words, for such a time as this. Tom Bombadil tells Frodo that their meeting, when he saves the hobbits from Old Man Willow, was not because he heard their calls for help. "Just chance brought me then, if chance you call it," he says. One of the best examples of the interplay between providence and choice is Gandalf's recounting of the story of Bilbo's finding the ring. As he and Frodo discuss the history of the creature Gollum, he says, "It was the strangest event in the whole history of the ring so far. Bilbo's arrival just at that time, and putting his hand on it blindly in the dark. There was more than one power at work, Frodo. The ring was trying to get back at its master. It had slipped from Isildur's hand and betrayed him. Then when a chance came, it caught poor Deagol, and he was murdered. And after that Gollum, and it had devoured him. It could make no further use of him. He was too small and mean. And as long as it stayed with him, he would never leave his deep pool again. So now, when its master was awake once more and sending out his dark thought from Mirkwood, it abandoned Gollum, only to be picked up by the most unlikely person imaginable, Bilbo from the Shire. Behind that there was something else at work beyond any design of the ringmaker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker, in which case you also were meant to have it, and that may be an encouraging thought. Here the wizard first begins to explain to Frodo that he has been chosen. But we also see that choices matter, because as for Bilbo, when Frodo comments that it's a pity he didn't kill Gollum when he had the chance, Gandalf replies, "Pity. It was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity." Finally, when his true plight is clear, when Frodo realizes the only way to destroy the ring is to take it to Mordor, he exclaims, "I wish I had never seen the ring. Why did it come to me? Why was I chosen?" "Such questions cannot be answered," said Gandalf. You may be sure that it was not for any merit that others do not possess, not for power or wisdom at any rate, but you have been chosen, and you must therefore use such strength and heart and wits as you have. Another example of choice and free will comes again at the Council of Elrond, when Boromir explains the circumstances that brought him to Rivendell. It's actually his brother, Faramir, who is first called, we might say. He has a dream several times, but he's troubled in his thought, and he deliberates for a long time. As soon as Boromir has the dream, though, he puts himself forward and he goes to seek Rivendell. What's going on here? Well, those of us who know and love Faramir know that he is of far nobler character than his older brother. And we get the sense that he was the first choice, so to speak, but that he deliberated for too long. Timing was critical. So the powers that sent his dream then called Boromir, who was the riskier choice because of his pride, because he would go with less deliberation. And of course we know that despite his giving in to temptation, he does serve a valuable role as part of the Fellowship of the Ring, just as Faramir does when he meets Frodo and Sam much later. So we see that while Providence is at work all along, everyone's choice matters. Frodo is chosen, but he is also the one who must choose what to do. Faramir is chosen, but he chooses at first poorly, or maybe just too slowly, and later he chooses well. In fact, when the various chosen characters succumb to temptations or make mistakes, it's rarely without consequence. But they also, just like Melkor's dissonant chords being woven into Ilúvatar's greater music, become opportunities for grace and an even more beautiful good. Though Faramir might have been a better member for the Fellowship of the Ring, Boromir's temptation and heroic death proved a humbling and salvific experience he might not have otherwise had. And of course, the grand eucatastrophe of the whole series is the moment in Mount Doom when Frodo fails. Even though he is the chosen one, in the end he succumbs to the temptation to claim the ring for himself. But he is stopped by Gollum, who is greedy for the ring as well, who gloats over his prize and, as Providence has it, slips into the fire with the ring, thus fulfilling the quest. So we see that Frodo is saved by grace, and that Bilbo's pity in sparing Gollum's life leads to salvation for the whole Middle-earth. Now, as I finish this video on Providence, I'll point out one more detail of the Lord of the Rings series that I find helpful in forming my own imagination. Recall that Hebrew spirituality constantly looks back at God's acts of salvation in the past in order to bring comfort and hope to the present. Tolkien's characters do the exact same thing, especially Sam. As Frodo grows more and more weary from the burden of the ring, Sam begins recounting the songs and tales of the past heroes and great events of Middle-earth. In doing so, he grows into the realization that they themselves are connected to the heroes that they idolize. Here's their conversation as they climb their way into Mordor through the pass of Cirith Ungol. This is close to the end of the Two Towers. "I don't like anything here at all," said Frodo. "Step or stone, breath or bone, earth, air, and water all seem accursed. But so our path is laid." "Yes, that's so," said Sam, "and we shouldn't be here at all if we'd known more about it before we started. But I suppose it's often that way. The brave things in the old tales and songs, Mr. Frodo, adventures as I used to call them. I used to think that they were things the wonderful folk of the stories went out and looked for, because they wanted them, because they were exciting and life was a bit dull, a kind of sport, as you might say. But that's not the way of it with the tales that really mattered, or the ones that stay in the mind. Folks seem to have been landed into them, usually. Their paths were laid that way, as he put it. But I expect they had lots of chances, like us, of turning back. Only they didn't. And if they had, we shouldn't know, because they'd have been forgotten. We hear about those as just went on, and not all to a good end, mind you. At least not what folk inside a story and not outside it call a good end. You know, coming home and finding things all right, though not quite the same. Like old Mr. Bilbo. But those aren't always the best tales to hear, though they might be the best tales to get landed in. I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into." "I wonder," said Frodo, "but I don't know. And that's the way of a real tale. Take any one that you're fond of. You may know or guess what kind of tale it is, happy ending or sad ending, but the people in it don't know, and you don't want them to. No, sir, of course not. Baron now, he never thought he was going to get that Silmaril from the Iron Crown in Thangorodrim, and yet he did, and that was a worse place and a blacker danger than ours. But that's a long tale, of course, and goes on past the happiness and into grief and beyond it. And the Silmaril went on and came to Eärendil. And why, sir, I never thought of that before. You've got some of the light of it in that star glass that the lady gave you. Why, to think of it, we're in the same tale still. It's going on. Don't the great tales never end? No, they never end as tales, said Frodo, but the people in them come and go when their part's ended. Our part will end later, or sooner. Frodo and Sam and all the hobbits regularly place themselves in this grand narrative of history, and their insight brings them to the realization that while their choices matter, the main choice is one of obedience. Ultimately, they are not entrusted with bringing all of history to its good end. Rather, they are tasked with being obedient to their calling, which in Frodo and Sam's case is a dark road. But their hope is founded in their historical placement. Simply knowing the stories of heroes past allows them to envision and expect a future after their quest has succeeded, regardless of what happens to them. What about us? When things in the news look grim, when we go through trials, are we confined by the stresses of the present? Or do we have the freedom of the big picture to trust in God's story because of the hope we have in the resurrection? May all of us take a page out of Frodo and Sam's book and remember the hope we have in our great hero. As always, I look forward to our discussion on Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. on Zoom. You can look at the description of this video for instructions on how to join our discussion. And our icebreaker question for the week is, which is your favorite character? I'm excited to hear your picks. God bless you.